talking about arrays. The idea of arrays is to offer a way of packing together multiple data of same type. For instance, if we want to track the position of a bishop on a chessboard, programmatically we first need a way to identify each cell on the board, using some sort of coordinates. So far, we learned how to store numeric data in variables like ints. In this case, however, they would not be of much use. First, there are 64 cells on a chessboard. Declaring a variable for each of them already sounds insane, not to mention the fact that we would actually need two variables for each of these cells in order to keep the rows and the cells values. Instead, we can simply use arrays, which will allow us to store multiple values of the same kind in a single variable. Values of the same kind means that we cannot store different kind of values in the same array. If we declare an array of type int, we can only store integer values inside it, and not booleans or floats. To better visualize the way an array is a sequence of elements, have a look at this representation. Each of these boxes contains a stored value and an index. This index is used so that we can find the location of a specific cell inside the array. It is very important to remember that array indexes always start from 0, not 1. Consequently, if I say the array element located at index 3, this actually means the fourth cell in the sequence of elements of the said array, because we start the index counting from 0, and the first of this cell is located at index 0. There are generally two types of arrays: one-dimensional arrays, known as vectors, and multidimensional arrays, of which the most used are two-dimensional arrays, also called matrices. The way we declare an array, let's pick one of type int for simplicity, is not much different than the way we declare a normal int variable. By placing a pair of opening and closing square brackets after the variable type, I instructed the compiler that I want an array of that type rather than a single variable. Array sizes are set when we initialize them, and they are fixed. We cannot resize an array after it was initialized with a certain size. I have not taught you yet what reference types are, but for the record, arrays are reference type. This means that we initialize them using the new keyword, and they have the default value of null. This is because the memory of the element is not yet allocated. In my above code, I initialized an array of type int with a fixed size of 6 elements. Since array indexing always starts from 0, these elements each received an index ranging from 0 to 5. All these elements have the default int value of 0, since I have not yet assigned any values to them. You obviously cannot initialize negative size arrays, just as you can't initialize it with a different type than the type it was declared. In other words, you cannot write this. You can also initialize arrays with custom values, where you explicitly specify the elements that will constitute the array items. Since newer version of C#, you have multiple ways of declaring and initializing an array, such as these, but they are not mandatory and you should not concern yourself with them. They are only what programmers call syntactic sugar. Once you declare and initialize an array, you can access its elements to both read or write a value, just like a normal variable. Have a look at this example. I was able to assign values to the elements of the array by accessing them via their index, and then I could also retrieve the values I have previously set also by using their index. You will be able to visualize this better after you will look at the graphical representation of the array. Since my array was declared as an array of type integer, all the elements to which I have not assigned any value have the default value of an int variable, 0. On the other side, the elements to which I have assigned a value are clearly visible. You cannot directly print an array to the console. If you want to print all its elements' values, there are different ways of doing that, so do not expect this to work. This is because arrays work very well in combinations with loops, which I explained in the previous lesson. Of course, if you want to display or set the values of the elements of the array, you can always just manually set or get them individually one by one, but this is really not the way it should be done. Using a for loop, we can assign values to all the elements of an array by using a special property of any array called length, which will give us the number of elements of that array. All we need to do is use our for loop to iterate through all the elements of the array and give them a value at the same time. To do so, we specify that our loop needs to iterate starting from 0 to the length of the array, -1. Why -1? Because indexes of the elements of an array start at 0. So we need to iterate from 0, and the length property gives us the number of elements of the array, starting the count at 1. Since the starting condition of our loop is 0 based and the ending one is 1 based, we need to normalize them. The procedure of reading the values of the elements of an array using a loop is even more simple and intuitive. When I explained the for each loop, I was not able to offer you a very descriptive definition because it was based on concepts that were not yet taught. At the time, you did not know what a collection of elements is. Well, arrays are fixed collection of elements of the same type. If I declare an array of type string containing some elements, I can access those elements by using a for loop, just like I explained earlier, or I could use a for each loop like this. It almost sounds like plain English, for each string name in names, etc. The difference between using a for and a for each loop is that the first one is slightly faster and will allow you a greater level of control over the process of iteration. You can do it upwards, downwards, by any desired step, like for instance every other 2 elements and so on. The for each loop will simply and automatically iterate the whole array starting from its first element. Be aware that if you try to access an element of an array by using an index greater than the range of indexes of the array, your program will generate a special kind of error called an exception and will most likely crash. In the next lesson, I will explain 2 topics that are rather advanced: multidimensional arrays and arrays of arrays, which are both rather rarely used, but every programmer should still have at least a very basic idea about them. Until then, goodbye.